Thank you, Neil. By the way, I have some handouts that I will give to anyone who wants afterwards, so you don't have to frantically take notes from the slides. And this lecture will be posted on YouTube probably in about a week. This is a National Opera Week event. There are lots of interesting National Opera Week events. There's one tomorrow night at Stevens Tech that I'll be doing on opera and media technology and how opera created the modern media world. But tonight we're talking about baseball. Neil thanked Boston Properties, which I do too. I also thank Neil, Going, Gone Sports Gallery, and I'd like to thank World Stage for providing the screen and the projector tonight. So here's a picture of opera and baseball together. When did this start? Well, let's look at some of the connections between opera and baseball. This is ripped from the headlines. This is the New York Times website last night. Opera star Joyce DiDonato will sing national anthem if series reaches Game 7. And the Major League Baseball originally offered her the national anthem for Game 6, and she said, "Sorry, but I'm teaching some kids for Game 6. So they said, okay, we'll give you Game 7 if there's a Game 7. So turned out there was a Game 7. She sent me an email, said, unbelievable. So that will happen in about an hour. Here is another recent event. Joe Torre got inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. And at the right is something that he owns, which is an autographed baseball. Okay, there's millions of autographed baseballs. What's so special about that? This one is autographed by Luciano Pavarotti. And Stan Musial also had a baseball autographed by Luciano Pavarotti. James Michener has a baseball autographed by Luciano Pavarotti. Here are some more connections. At the upper left, you recognize Yogi Berra, of course. He is demonstrating the proper grip to Eleanor Steber, who was an opera singer. We'll talk a little bit more about her later. In the middle, Sandy Koufax, of course. He was such an opera fan that his teammates complained when they were on the road. They would be down in the bar. He would be up in his room listening to opera. At the right is Babe Ruth and Dorothy Jordan. The poster, by the way, says Jordan. It's actually Jordan. Notice how Babe looks a little tentative in talking to her. I'll talk a little bit more about baseball players being tentative next to opera singers. In the middle on the bottom, we have opera singer Beverly Sills. And then a guy who, I don't know if I should call him an opera singer or a ball player. He was a ball player named Moishe Miller, and then he became an opera star named Robert Merrill. Sang almost 1,000 performances at the Met. But after he retired from the Met, he managed and coached the Yankees old-timers. He had his own Yankee uniform. We'll talk more about him later. And then, of course, the boss, George Steinbrenner. And then at the bottom left, Ty Cobb. Now, what does Ty Cobb have to do with opera? Well, Ty Cobb performed on Opera House stages, which I will point out later. But when he came to Detroit, someone gave him a pass to the Opera House, and he just loved it. And so he went to the Opera House over and over and over again. Various opera houses would have Ty Cobb nights where he would be the star. He did that in Syracuse at the Wheating Opera House. Now, this, of course, is Lou Gehrig at the right, and he was felled by the disease that bears his name. And if he hadn't been felled by that, then certainly he would have had records that endured for the ages. But little by little, people have been chipping away at his records. So up at the top is Derek Jeter on the left, who took over the Yankee doubles record from Lou Gehrig this year. Down at the bottom, of course, the famous moment when Cal Ripken Jr. took over the consecutive games record from Lou Gehrig. But Gehrig has one record that will probably never be topped by any ball player, and it's an opera record. What happened was, like many people, Gehrig was taken to the opera the first time by his wife. And the opera turned out to be Tristan und Isolde, which is a very, very long opera. And it was being sung in German, and this wasn't in the days when there were titles, so you couldn't know exactly what they were singing, except for the fact that Gehrig was fluent in German. So he's watching Tristan and Isolde. They get to the end of the opera, which is this section called the Liebestod, or the Love Death, and tears are streaming down his eyes. So what does he do? He goes to the very next performance of Tristan and Isolde. And then he goes to the next performance of Tristan and Isolde, and the next performance of Tristan and Isolde. In one season at the Met, Lou Gehrig attended 7 performances of Tristan and Isolde, each of them more than 5 hours long. That's more than 35 consecutive hours of Tristan and Isolde, a record that will not be equaled by any ball player, I am fairly certain. That, by the way, next to him is Kirsten Flagstad. She was the Isolde that he kept hearing. Here is Ricardo Muti pitching for the Cubs. Actually, he just threw out the first pitch. And this person is Jim Naples. You're probably not familiar with him. He's the house manager at the Metropolitan Opera House. But before that, he was the house manager at Yankee Stadium. And so he has a World Series ring, which he wears prominently. But he's not the only person at the Metropolitan Opera who has a World Series ring. He's not even the person with the most World Series rings. There's a person at the Metropolitan Opera who has 5 World Series rings because he worked at Yankee Stadium for a long time. Here's a new meaning to "the bases are loaded." Somebody at an opera house once asked if they could go out and sing if that were the case. Some things that baseball and opera have in common: some language like bases, warm-up, coach, manager, hit, score, line. Both of them sometimes have long performances. Both of them seem to be having some difficulty getting big attendance today. Opera gave baseball luxury boxes. Luxury boxes were invented for opera houses. Baseball gave opera record keeping. If you look at the archives of the Metropolitan Opera, you can find out immediately how many performances somebody sang, how many times they were in Tristan or whatever. And what else did baseball maybe give opera? Well, this is an operatic hot dog vendor at Comerica Stadium in Detroit. His name is Charlie Marcuse. He was fired recently because he says there is no ketchup in baseball. And I happen to agree with him from a culinary standpoint, but on the other hand, the customer is always right. And you may have seen A Night at the Opera, the Marx Brothers movie. At one point, the overture to the opera Il Trovatore segues into Take Me Out to the Ball Game, and Groucho starts vending peanuts. And you might have seen a cartoon that appeared in the New Yorker on April 14th of this year by Liam Walsh. It's somebody at the opera, and there's a hot dog vendor coming up the aisle, and the caption is, "There's no Frank like an opera Frank." But some people are saying, seriously, the opera people are taking themselves too seriously. Why don't we have food vending at the opera? And some of the opera purists say, could never do that. Well, here's a painting from 1740 of opening night at the Royal Opera House in Turin, Italy. The whole painting is in the upper left, and the things that I've circled in red are the vendors who are working the aisles during the opera. One seems to be doing beverages, and one seems to be doing food. This, at the bottom right, is an opera singer. He's sung at many of the world's great opera houses. Robert Pomykov, he's a bass, but he loves baseball. And so he and some friends created this pub called Opera Bob's in Toronto. It is the #1 baseball pub in Toronto, and that's why you see it has a Blue Jays flag flying, and one of the brews that they serve is Grapefruit League Imperial Pale Ale. Now, what do these cheerleaders have to do with opera? Well, they're at the Coors Light Sky Deck. And where is the Coors Light Sky Deck? If you can make out the words under that, it says, at the Detroit Opera House. This is the view from the roof of the Detroit Opera House. And that's Comerica Field. So you can go to the Coors Light Sky Deck, drink beer, watch the baseball game, and then go downstairs and watch an opera. So that's an introduction. Now let's talk about the very beginning when baseball and opera came together. And it was a tragic beginning There were two actors who were performing Macbeth in New York. One of them was the American actor Edwin Forrest, and another was the British actor William Charles Macready. Now, Edwin Forrest was performing at the Broadway Theater downtown, and Macready was performing at a place that was called the Astor Place Theater, but the previous year was known as the Astor Opera House. Well, the fans of Forrest didn't like that Macready was performing, and they wanted to disrupt his performances. And so they went to the world's first famous ball field, which was the Elysian Fields in Hoboken, New Jersey, across the river, and they hired thugs from among the ball players. And they paid them to go and throw things at Macready, just as some people want to do now at Death of Klinghoffer. And this accelerated to the point where it was a deadly riot. The militia was called out and so on, and they wanted to kill Macready. So somebody had to spirit him out of the opera house, and I'm showing a little bit of the obituary for Edward Plunkett Fry from the New York Times, and he spirited Macready out of the opera house. Now, how did he do that? Well, he was previously the impresario at the opera house. He was the person who put on the operas there. He later, by the way, invented electronic home entertainment, but that's a different story. How about the law? Baseball has some very peculiar aspects of law. People think it has an antitrust exemption. There's the reserve clause, which is kind of like legalized slavery. Well, where did the reserve clause come from? Well, you've heard of Hannes Wagner. There's something in the gallery over there with his signature and his picture. The reason he was called Hannes Wagner is it was the best his teammates could come up with for what his real name was, which was Johannes. So he was Johannes Wagner. The woman at the upper right here is Johanna Wagner. She was the niece of the opera composer. And she went to England to perform, and she had a contract with one opera house, and then another opera house offered her a better deal, and she said, great, I'm going there. And so the first opera house sued and won, and that became the basis of baseball's reserve clause. If you have signed with a team, you're not allowed to play for another team. Now, how about the antitrust exemption? Well, Oscar Hammerstein, not Oscar Hammerstein II, the lyricist, but Oscar Hammerstein, who made opera houses all around the world, he created the Manhattan Opera Company. And if you go down to 34th Street, you can still see his opera house there. It's now called the Manhattan Center. And he competed directly with the Metropolitan Opera, and the Metropolitan Opera didn't like that. So the head of the board of the Met at the time, Otto Kahn, bought Hammerstein out. And he had a contract that said he is not allowed to compete with the Metropolitan Opera. And he just couldn't help himself, and he started doing opera again. And so the Metropolitan Opera sued, and as a result of the lawsuit, it was declared that opera, like sports and other entertainments, is not subject to antitrust laws. And that is why baseball can have what is considered an antitrust exemption. Now, what about opera baseball? This is baseball, but something to do with opera. Well, it began as early as 1870. Tony Pastor's Opera House, this is a notice in the New York Times, was playing the Olympic. They won, by the way. By 1875, there were notices of San Francisco Opera House baseball teams that were playing, and many opera houses had baseball teams. But something interesting happened in 1909. Now, the image at the bottom right is the Huntington Avenue American League baseball grounds. That's where the first World Series was played in 1903. The building that you see at the far right behind the ball field, that's the Boston Opera House. Now, I mentioned Otto Kahn was the head of the board of the Metropolitan Opera. He was also on the board of the Boston Opera. And when somebody at the Met came to him and said, you know, the Met ought to have a baseball team, he said, great. And he bought them uniforms and equipment, and he arranged a match for them in Boston, and he sent them all up by steamer so they would be all refreshed. They all had staterooms, and they went up there and they lost. Okay, not a big problem. It's a game. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. By the way, they were the first Mets, as you can see from the stuff here. It's the Metropolitan Players. But then Kahn found out that Boston had hired a ringer. So he got furious, and he insisted that the Met hire 2 ringers. So they did, one from the Highlanders, the team that became the Yankees, and another from the Giants. And the Met trounced Boston. And everything was well. Both teams had a good time. They went out to Coney Island. They had dinner on the Met. Now, how about baseball opera? The most famous baseball opera is this one. I'm showing a picture from Glimmerglass because Glimmerglass is an opera company that's in Cooperstown. And we all know Cooperstown has some connection to baseball. This is called The Mighty Casey. It's based on the poem, and a lot of people think that's the only opera that was written about baseball. But in fact, it was not. This is probably the earliest opera that was written about baseball. It's in 1888. The libretto is actually 1887. It was performed at the Grand Opera House in Philadelphia, not the Academy of Music. It's called Angela, or The Umpire's Revenge. The words and music were by Paul Eaton, but it was scored by John Philip Sousa, who wrote many operas. Had a terrific performance in Philadelphia, great reviews. As best I know, that is the only performance it has ever had. And I hope somebody can bring it back someday. But there was baseball and opera even before that. This is 3 years earlier, an opera called The Black Hussar, that's the English name for it anyway, by Carl Millacher. And they had a trio called Read the Answer in the Stars. And here's part of the trio. The words in it: the small boy seized his baseball bat. He cried, "Well, let her come." The baseball flew. The small boy flopped. It knocked him deaf and dumb. He rallied, though, with one eye out. He gave his spine a rub. Said he, "I'm not dead yet. I belong to the New York Baseball Club." This is a game of grace, although we call it base. But when home runs are all run out, where shall we look for sport? Read the answer in the stars. They're all shortstops. Stop short. And this is just to show you that baseball operas are continuing. Some of you may have seen the poster that I did that had Bambino, which is an opera about Babe Ruth. Here is an opera called The Summer King. It's been performed in showcases quite a bit. It's the story of Josh Gibson, star of the Negro Leagues. How about baseball at the Opera House? This seems very strange. There was a spoof at an opera house in Brooklyn in 1867, Hooley's Opera House. They did a spoof of baseball. But beyond that, there was also other baseball at the Opera House. Here is Cleveland pitcher Bob Lemon, who was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1976. And this is from his induction speech, and he says he was introduced to baseball when his mother took him to the Opera House in Redlands, California. Now, what was his mother doing taking him to the Opera House to see the World Series in 1920, which is way before television? Well, here is a headline from the Atlanta Constitution from 1886, and it says, "Baseball at the Opera House, a complete and convenient arrangement to take the game in detail." And here is a paragraph from Sporting Life in 1885 saying that in Augusta, Georgia, they could go to the Opera House and they could watch baseball games, and people loved to pay their 10 cents, and everybody came every day. There were many systems starting in 1885 that were used for people to watch baseball games at opera houses for 50 years before television. The one on the left is a very, very basic system, but it earned enough money for its patenter to buy into the Boston Post. In the middle, they added motion. By 1891, they added electricity. Now, it's hard for you to visualize this stuff, so I'm delighted that I can show you 5 seconds of a newsreel that was just recently discovered buried in the Canadian Yukon. And because it was in these wonderful cold conditions, the film was actually preserved. It was able to be restored by the National Film Archive in Canada. And so I've looped the 5 seconds over and over so you can see what's going on. Notice that you can see the runners and what speed they're running at, and then you can see the ball and where it's being thrown. There it goes to the pitcher. There's the runner again. Okay, ball being thrown to first base. Now it goes to the pitcher. And that's the stuff that people would watch. And by 1886, in Detroit, they had developed the choreography of sportscasting. So rather than just saying, and this play, this happened, the guy would say, and it's a high fly, and it's out to Dalrymple. That's 1886. Well, by the time we get to 1894, we're now starting to introduce androids. The system at the right, 1895, was developed by Paul Chapman. It was used at a New York opera house. He then took it on tour to opera houses all around the country. His system was unique in that it allowed one person to operate it. And here we have something from the Richmond Times in 1895 talking about the androids there, and one viewer says, "Aren't they just the dearest, cutest little fellows you ever saw, and so polite? Why, they bow so as sweetly as real live men when they're applauded." And then another one says, "I declare I thought little Jake Wells looked positively handsome when he knocked that home run." And then at the right, just to show you how long this continued, there's an ad from the Arizona Daily Star in Tucson from 1931. And it's saying, hey, come watch the World Series between the Philadelphia Athletics and the St. Louis Cardinals. It's free, we're paying, it's at the Opera House, and every play will be reproduced on the playograph less than 1 minute after the play is made. Here's a system that was called the Coleman Lifelike Scoreboard. You're seeing what it looked like from the front of the Opera House and from the back. 400 projectors were used in this one to make it look real. Okay, so that was baseball at the Opera House. How about opera on the ball field? Well, some of you may be familiar with this sort of thing. This is AT&T Park where the Giants play, and when they showed Aida on the LED screen, 32,000 fans showed up. Those are opera fans, not baseball fans. And you can see that they're crowding the outfield as well as the stands. Notice that they're not on the infield. I have a story about that in a moment. But 32,000 fans is actually nothing, because the largest single-site, single-opera audience ever was at Expos Stadium in Montreal in 1988, where they also watched Aida, and 44,000 people paid to attend. A friend of mine who is Scotty Bowman's brother, those of you who know the National Hockey League coach Scotty Bowman, he attended and he said it was just wonderful and it was amazing how intimate it could sound. Well, that's 1988 after they had some sound reinforcement stuff. Here is Opera Under the Stars at Navin Field in Detroit in 1935. Here is Aida at Montreal Stadium in 1930. This is where the Montreal Royals played. That's the team that Jackie Robinson played on before he came to the Dodgers. This stuff started effectively at the Polo Grounds in New York in 1923, and then it spread to Ebbets Field in Brooklyn, Cleveland Municipal Stadium, and a bunch more. But there were earlier ones. So here you see a performance of Siegfried, or an ad for a performance of Siegfried, that the Metropolitan Opera was taking on a baseball park tour. And this was going to be performed in what we today call Wrigley Field. The Wrigleys hadn't bought it yet, so it was just called Cubs Baseball Park. But it's at Clark and Addison, which is where Wrigley Field is. Now, the tour started at Yale, and then it went to Forbes Field in Pittsburgh, where it went well, except after the first two acts it started raining, so everybody got rain checks. They came back the next night, they saw Act 3 of Siegfried. Then it went to, or was supposed to go to Wrigley Field, but that one got rained out. So the next stop was Robeson Field in St. Louis. And the people who ran Robeson Field, remember I showed you in San Francisco, no one was sitting in the infield. They said, we have a really fine infield, we don't want you to put the stage there. And the Met people said, but, and they said, no buts, you have to put the stage way out in the outfield. So the Met people shrugged, they put the stage out there, a very large stage, lots of machinery and so on. 12,000 opera fans were at Robeson Field. Again, this is in the era before sound reinforcement. The conductor does the downbeat, nobody hears a thing. So the 12,000 opera fans ripped the benches out of the stands, ran onto the field, set up in front of the stage where they could hear stuff, thereby destroying the infield. They then went on to Cincinnati, where everything was fine. Some crossovers. At the left is a poster of Cap Anson. He was one of the first superstars of baseball. He played for the team that became the Cubs. It was called the White Stockings. You would think the White Stockings became the White Sox, but no, but they became the Cubs. He started performing in 1888 on Opera House stages, and by 1895 he got top billing. In the middle, we have Ty Cobb. Now, Ty Cobb needed to do something in the off-season, so he performed as a football player, which is why you see the football behind him, starting at Taylor's Opera House in Newark, New Jersey, and continuing to the Augusta Opera House. This says the world's greatest baseball player in the greatest college play ever performed. I don't know that that's such high praise. And then at the right, we have Babe Ruth, who is performing here at an opera house in Vancouver. And he sang. Babe actually sang on opera house stages. They wrote a song for him called Little by Little and Bit by Bit, I Am Making a Vaudeville Hit. More recently, here is Don Mattingly performing on an opera house stage in Evansville, Indiana. He's performing as Mother Ginger in the ballet, The Nutcracker, but it was an opera house stage. And there we have the boss, George Steinbrenner, being the boss and conducting the New York Pops. And here again we have picture of Moishe Miller. He played semi-pro baseball, and one of his teammates was Tommy Holmes, and he did that so he could pay for singing lessons. When he started singing, he changed his name to Robert Merrill. He sang almost 1,000 performances at the Metropolitan Opera, sang the national anthem for the Yankees for 3 decades, had his own uniform, was originally created for Billy Martin, number 1.5. He then later managed the Yankees old-timers, and he tells a story. Remember Babe Ruth being sheepish by Dorothy Jordan? Well, Mickey Mantle came up to Robert Merrill to ask him for an autographed recording. And Merrill reported that Mantle was kind of sheepish and nervous about approaching him for this. And he died watching Game 1 of the World Series in 2004. Nice way to go. Here is another Joyce from Kansas, not Joyce DiDonato. This is Joyce Castle, performing in the world premiere of an opera at Cooperstown. The opera was called Central Park. And who paid for her singing lessons? Well, it was the guy at the right, a pitcher by the name of George Malachi, who pitched to Babe Ruth and was in the minors. Here we have another opera singer on the left. This one is Geraldine Farrar. She was such a famous opera singer that the picture in the middle is of her performing in a movie of Carmen. But it's a movie of Carmen in the silent era. So she was an opera singer who was the star of a silent movie. And why was she the star of the silent movie? Because she was a star, and she had the name recognition, and people would go there. Well, who paid for her singing lessons? There's some dispute here. There's this story. They wrapped her game in tinfoil that you can see in the book, The Lore and Legends of Baseball. And the idea is her father was Sid Farrar, who played first base for Philadelphia. And the story is that wherever he went, the ball players would collect tinfoil from tobacco wrappers and give it to him, and he eventually collected enough tinfoil that he was able to take his daughter to Paris and have her study opera there. He did take his daughter to Paris. She did study opera there. Unfortunately, he retired from baseball when she was 8 years old. So either she was very precocious, or that story is just a legend. Now, here's another picture from Glimmerglass, the Cooperstown Opera Company. This is the Pirates of Penzance. The guy on the right, this is somebody in a different role. He's not playing the Pirate King. He's playing Captain Corcoran in the opera HMS Pinafore. His name was Signor Broccolini. He was the first Pirate King. The Pirate King role in the Pirates of Penzance was written for him by Gilbert and Sullivan. But before he became Signor Broccolini, which is a name that he took because he lived in Brooklyn, he played first base for Detroit. And so Peter Morris, who's one of the great baseball historians, did a paper on this in the Baseball History Journal 9, and it was called From First Base to Primo Basso. primo basso meaning first base. Here's some other people who moved from baseball to opera. At the upper left, Ara Berberian. He pitched for the Kansas City Athletics and then sang 333 operas at the Metropolitan Opera. Down below him is Harry Howell, a major league pitcher who had stomach problems. So he went to a doctor, and the doctor said, I don't know, but try singing lessons. So he tried singing lessons, his stomach problems went away, and he said, formerly baseball was everything, now it's music and baseball. And then we have at the upper right, Sammy Strang. He helped the Giants win the World Series in 1905. He's the person for whom the word pinch hitter was invented because he would always hit in a pinch. He went to Paris to study opera with Jean Dureski and became so good that many opera companies offered him jobs, but he said, I'm sorry, I love baseball, I can't go to opera. So he came back. He coached at West Point. He then went down to the Chattanooga Lookouts, where he coached, managed, and eventually owned the team. And then he sold the team, and right after he sold the team, this happened. The woman that you see at the right, who's just pitched a ball, her name is Jackie Mitchell. She was 17 years old at the time. There was an exhibition game between the Yankees and the Chattanooga Lookouts, and in 7 consecutive pitches, she struck out Babe Ruth and then Lou Gehrig. Well documented. She had been taught by Dazzy Vance a particular pitch, a dropping pitch. By the way, she looks like maybe she's wearing man's clothes or something. She later played for the House of David team, which required her to wear a beard. On the left, some of you may recognize Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, the first commissioner of baseball, commissioner of life, and the person that he's touching heads with is John Philip Sousa, opera composer and march king. This is when Landis asked Sousa to write a baseball march for him. Now, Sousa not only wrote marches and operas and scored the first baseball opera, but he had not one, but 2 baseball teams of his own. You can see the Sousas over there on the right. The reason he had 2 teams was he was worried that he might be on tour someplace and no one would challenge his team. And he couldn't stand the idea that he wouldn't be able to play baseball, so he wanted 2 teams so they could play each other. By the way, after the famous Spalding World Baseball Tour of 1889, he played the first baseball game in Paris at the Paris World's Fair of 1900 on July 4th. Well, here's an opera that Sousa wrote, El Capitan. You may not be familiar with the opera, but you're probably familiar with the march. And the person who played El Capitan, who it was written for, was DeWolf Hopper. DeWolf Hopper was the most famous baseball fan in New York. Not only was he an opera performer, but he was allowed to drive right onto the field at the Polo Grounds. He had his own seating section that was locked with a padlock that he had a key to. Absolutely terrific guy. This is a team picture of the Chicago White Stockings in 1888. And the person who's kind of all folded up there, third from the right, that's DeWolf Hopper. The person in the white hat next to him, that's Digby Bell, another opera performer. And the person behind them in kind of the white hat, that was the team mascot, Clarence Duval, who was also an opera performer. So here we have 3 opera performers in the team picture of the Chicago White Stockings. Now, why was that? Well, on August the 14th, 1888, there was a game between the New York Giants and the Chicago White Stockings. And pitching for the Giants was Tim Keefe, who had just won 19 consecutive games in one season. It is a record that has yet to be exceeded. It was matched only once by Rube Marquard, who also performed on Opera House stages. But the shortstop got sick, there was a substitute, the Giants lost. So the Times ran this headline, Chicago beats New York. Note the hyphen in New York, that's what they did in those days. And it was devastating. The story said that if comedians could cry, DeWolf Hopper would have been sobbing. But he had already made arrangements that he was going to take both teams to the opera that night. he was performing a Johann Strauss II opera called Prince Methuselah. And so he does take them to the opera that night, and the Times runs another headline in the same edition, and this is that headline. And this is why.
The outlook wasn't brilliant for the Mudville Nine that day. The score stood 4-2 with but one inning more to play. And so when Cooney died at first and Burroughs did the same, a sickly silence fell upon the patrons of the game. A straggling few got up to go in deep despair. The rest clung to that hope which springs eternal in the human breast. And they thought if only Casey could forget a whack at that. We'd put up even money now with Casey at the back.
I won't play the whole thing. That, by the way, is not a recording from 1888. It's a recording from 1906, still pretty early. DeWolf Hopper was the first person publicly to recite Casey at the Bat, and he did it in the middle of the opera Prince Methuselah. This is not so unusual. In Johann Strauss II operas, people often do performances of whatever it is that they do in the middle of the opera. You could have a basketball player shooting hoops or something like that. He went on to recite the poem by his count 10,000 more times, by other people's count 40,000 more times. He is certainly the person most associated with Casey at the Bat. So that's where the opera The Mighty Casey comes from. What about the other wonderful cultural artifact of baseball, Take Me Out to the Ball Game, baseball's most famous song, written by Jack Norworth and Albert von Tilzer, neither of whom had been to a baseball game when they wrote the song. Where was it introduced? Well, there are two scholarly views of this. On the left is a book that was written in part by Tim Wiles, who was the head of the Giamatti Research Center at the Baseball Hall of Fame at the time he did the book. And at the right is a book by another historian, Amy Worf McGuigan. And they come to different conclusions, but both of their conclusions are the same in one regard. It was introduced at a Brooklyn opera house. The book on the left says it was introduced at the Amphion Academy, and lest you have some concern that the Amphion Academy was not an opera house, here it is performing a whole week of Wagner by the Met, which the Met Archives did not know about until I made this discovery and gave it to them. And then at the right we have the Grand Opera House, which is where Amy Worf McGuigan, I think, makes a very good case that Take Me Out to the Ball Game was introduced, and that's a program for Tosca over there. Now, what about the language? I told you about the Lou Gehrig thing. Fortunately, he could speak German. Here is a quote that's often attributed to H.L. Mencken. It was actually by his partner, George John Nathan. Opera in English is, in the main, just about as sensible a plea as baseball in Italian. Well, at the time, they didn't play baseball in Italy. Now they do. There's somebody from the Italian national team. And so when Sid Caesar decided to spoof the opera Pagliacci, he did something interesting. You're going to come into this, for those of you who know opera, this is sort of in his version of the tail end of Vesti la Juba, where he's putting on the clown makeup, and then something else happens with Carl Reiner and Nanette Fabre. So I'm sure you recognize the tune there. If you did not recognize the words, don't worry. It wasn't really Italian, it was fake Italian. And now let me tell you about a particular building. It's a building that's still in New York City. It's called the Ansonia. It's on the corner of 73rd Street and Broadway. And if you go there, there's a little Babe Ruth shrine in the lobby, and you can look at some interesting artifacts from him. It opened in 1904 with a rooftop farm where they could get fresh eggs and milk for the people. It was climate controlled. They sent freezing brine through the walls. It also had pneumatic tubes in the walls for delivering messages, so the walls were really thick. Well, because the walls were really thick, you could sing to your heart's content and no one would hear you. 24-hour room service, 2 indoor pools. One of them was the world's largest at the time, had indoor miniature golf, and it was near an express stop on the subway, the brand new subway. So this was attractive both to opera singers and to ball players. And so there were a tremendous number of ball players and opera singers who stayed there. The Black Sox scandal, the throwing of the World Series in 1919, was initiated at the Ansonia. Christy Walsh, who was the first sports agent, he signed Babe Ruth at the Ansonia. Ty Cobb, who became rich when he retired from baseball, largely because of investing in Coca-Cola, he made the decision to do that investment at the Ansonia. Ray Chapman, the only person in Major League Baseball history to be killed by a pitch, he was staying at the Ansonia on the day of his death. And others, Pete Alexander, Sleepy Bill Burns, and so on. Honus Wagner was one of the people who was at the Ansonia. In opera, it's just a cavalcade of names, composers, singers, conductors, impresarios. And I mentioned Eleanor Steber. She was the one that Yogi Berra was showing the grip to earlier in this lecture. She did a recording down in the basement of the Ansonia when one of the indoor pools had been turned into the continental baths. And her audience was dressed in formal black towels for the recording. 2 people at the Ansonia could be found wandering around in their robes. One was Babe Ruth, and this is Babe Ruth showing off his musical talents to Lou Gehrig at the Ansonia. He wore a robe because he went down to the barber every morning to get a shave, and he didn't feel he needed to get dressed before doing that. And then the other one was Lauritz Melchior at the right. He was the Tristan to Kirsten Flagstad's Isolde, who's the person you see on the left, and he was too big for the bathtubs at the Ansonia. And so he would put on a robe and go down to the indoor pool, and that was how he was able to bathe and stay clean. The 2 most iconic people of opera and baseball are Babe Ruth for baseball and Enrico Caruso for opera. So people who have been called the Babe Ruth of opera are people like Enrico Caruso, Beniamino Gigli, Luciano Pavarotti, Maria Callas even was called the Babe Ruth of opera. And people called the Caruso of baseball, people like Babe Ruth, of course, Joe DiMaggio, Lou Fonseca, and then somebody you may not have heard of, Marty McHale. Why Marty McHale? Because he organized the Red Sox quartet. He was a fine singer. So he was the Caruso of baseball because of his voice, not because of his talent on the field. But here are these 2 iconic people, and both of them could be found at the Ansonia. There's some question about whether Caruso lived there, but he certainly was there for dinners and visiting other people. So reporters would wait outside the Ansonia to see if they could get something good from somebody who was living there. And one day when Caruso came out, they said, "Oh, Signor Caruso, what do you think of the other famous resident of the Ansonia, Babe Ruth?" And Caruso responded, "I don't know. I never heard her sing." And so that's your introduction to baseball and opera. If you want more, just go to that website, bit.ly, baseball and opera. The capitalization matters, so you do need a capital B and a capital O. And I'll be happy to take any questions if anyone has. Yes?
When you were talking about the opera at the ballpark, no, I mean the baseball at the opera house, they were going specifically there to see baseball. There was no opera that night?
Well, there might have been opera that night, but remember, night games is a relatively recent invention. At Wrigley Field, they didn't put in lights until fairly recently. So they could watch a baseball game during the afternoon and then go to the opera that night. Same thing at the Coors Light Sky Deck at the Detroit Opera House. You can go and watch a baseball game up there and then go to the opera that night. By the way, again, don't forget I have some handouts here with lots more information. Help yourselves on your way out. Yes?
Who are some of the current players today who are playing who are considered opera lovers?
A tough question. The question is, who are some of the current players who are considered opera lovers? And the only answer I can give you is I just don't know. But Don Mattingly, to put on a dress and makeup, he's got to have some love of it.